Ty rozpoczniesz, Henryku.
Welcome to our sixth session of the International Autumn Bible Conference entitled Between Text and Reader, Exploring Strategies and Practices of Ancient and Contemporary Bible Translation. The presider of our today's session is Father Marcin Kowalski, and I just pass the voice to him and just let him do his job.
All right, thank you. Thank you, and welcome everybody. We've got 4 presenters at this session, so it's going to be longer than usual. Actually, all of them are stationed and teach in Rome, and most of them represent the school of Professor Craig Marcin. At least 3 of our presenters. So it's my joy to introduce the first presenter, who will be Father Tomasz Szymczak, a friar minor conventual. Defended his PhD at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, 2018, La ricezione del Vangelo di Matteo nella Vetus Syra, with Professor Craig Marcin, as mentioned. In the subsequent year, 2019, he published his dissertation in Analecta Biblica. He now teaches at the Pontifical Theological Faculty of St. Bonaventure, Rome, Italy, and is a publisher of Vox Patrum. He will be presenting the paper titled Bridging the Gap Between Text and Reader, the Role of the Double Translation in the Old Syriac Gospel Vetus Syra. So Father Tomasz, the floor is yours.
I'll try to share the presentation. I hope it works. And yes, thank you very much for the invitation to this conference, and greetings from Rome, from the convent of the 12 Apostles. So we are just beside the Pontifical Biblical Institute. And today I would like to speak about the fascinating linguistic and also somehow theological phenomenon known as the double translation. And I will show some examples from the old Syriac Gospels, especially from the Gospel of Matthew. So my presentation will proceed in 3 steps. First, I will define what the double translation is and what is not. Second, I will present a few examples from the Gospel themselves. And finally, I will consider some consequences of this unique translational approach. Because I'm the first speaker in this session dedicated to the Syriac versions of the Bible, I will try to present shortly what we are talking about when we talk about the Syriac translation of the New Testament, especially because we will be dealing with the New Testament translation only. So the earliest Syriac Gospel tradition is Diatessaron. So this is the production of Tatian. We are in the end or the middle of the second part of the 2nd century, so more or less like 170, 160 something. This was a single harmonized narrative that combined the 4 canonical Gospels into the one continuous account, widely used in the early Syriac Church. We do not possess any manuscript with Diatessaron. We have commentary of Ephraim to the Diatessaron and many translations. And the textual history and the textual situation of Diatessaron is a whole world of questions and hypotheses. But we know that there was such a translation like Diatessaron. By the late 2nd to 3rd centuries, the old Syriac Gospels offered an independent translation from Greek. And this translation is also known as Vetus Syra, is represented mainly by the Curetonianus and Sinaiticus manuscripts. I say mainly because of new discoveries in Sinai and also in Vatican Library. We have some palimpsests recently discovered that contains the text of the Old Syriac Gospels, and probably it is closer to the version that we know from Curetonianus and not in Sinaiticus. And then the old Syriac Gospels were later superseded by the Peshitta, so in the 4th and 5th centuries. And then once again we have the another versions, so the Philoxenian from the beginning of the 6th century, and then the Harklean version or Harklean revision from the beginning of the 7th century. So as we can see, in the short time, the Syriac churches, Syriac-speaking communities produced at least 5 different versions of the New Testaments. Some of them are complete, some of them we possess only fragments, and some of them we know only from the other sources, as I said about the Atesor. So in the first part of my presentation, I will just want to focus your attention on the double translation itself. Then I will present something about the double reading, which is very close to double translation, but should be probably distinguished from the double translation. And then the end, I will try to answer some first basic methodological question about the double translation. What is a double translation? Basically, we can speak about double translation every time when a single verb or noun is rendered by a translational doublet. And this definition comes from Michael Klein in his study Associative and Complementary Translation in the Targumim. Klein illustrates the phenomenon with several examples from the Targumic literature and explores the possible origins. Here we can see, for example, the Exodus 15:1, Ashira Ladonai, the verb shir, to sing, is rendered in the Targum Neophiti by 2 verbs, to praise, to confess, nodi, and then nishbach, to praise, to glorify. So 1 verb, then rendered in the translation by the 2 different verbs, more or less from the same semantic field. Another example of the double translation concerns, for example, the Hebrew noun hen, so favor, grace, which in Targum Neophiti is rendered over 20 times by the double expression hen vechesed. So, for instance, in Genesis 6:8, 18:3, and so on. So to summarize, double translation occurs whenever a single word, verb, or noun, or expression is translated by a doublet. It is very useful to distinguish double translation from what we might call a double reading, so lectio duplex. The classical definition we can find in Tov, Emmanuel Tov, when he defines a doublet or lectio duplex, double reading, conflate reading, as a particular type of redundancy created by the combination of 2 or 3 different and sometimes synonymous readings, either in juxtaposition or in close proximity. This doublet sometimes results from an erroneous juxtaposition of elements, and in other cases, they grow out of conscious desire to preserve alternative readings. This is why sometimes it is very difficult to distinguish them from the double translation itself. Here we can take a look on the example from the Luke 10:18. We have in the translation of the Sinaiticus, he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And then in Curetonianus, we see that this verb to fall, nafal, is repeated twice. Jesus said to them, I saw Satan who fall like lightning, which fall from heaven. So here probably the doublet of falling in the Curetonianus likely arose not from the intentional double translation, because pezonta in Greek can refer only to Satan, not to the lightning, but from a copying error. So we are dealing with the transmission of the Syriac text. Thus, this is not a true example of the double translation. As I said, sometimes it is useful to distinguish it. Sometimes we have to deal with a question about the Vorlage. Here, as we can see, the problem can be created in the Luke 2:48, when his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety. So the problem in the translation can be created by the rare verb odinao, which can be translated as to cause pain or to be anxious. Which of the translation shall we choose? Z bólem serca, adolorati, or maybe angosciati, z niepokojem, in great anxiety. So the Curetonianus is solving the problem, offering 2 expressions, rendering 2 different possibilities. And we have in Curetonianus, here the Sinaiticus has a lacuna, so we do not possess the Sinaiticus here, because, behold, we have been searching for you in distress and in great anxiety. Okay, it could be a great example of double translation if Codex Beze and other Latin manuscripts would not have a variant reading. We have a variant reading in Codex Beze. We have idu, hopater, kago, odinomenoi, kai lipumenoi, etzetumen se. We cannot speak here of genuine double translation because at least one Greek manuscript reads kai lipumenoi, having odinomenoi, kai lipumenoi, two words indicating the emotional state of Mary and Joseph as they search for Jesus. So the Syriac, therefore, may simply reflect a plus in its Greek forlage rather than a translational doublet. However, this example illustrates one of the methodological difficulties. If the Syriac text truly contains a double translation here, which is possible, then it should not be cited, as it is in Nestle Aland 28, for example, as a witness to the Greek variant kai lipumenoi. In textual criticism, we usually begin from the forlage hypothesis. When a Greek manuscript preserves a reading and that explains a Syriac divergence, we tend to privilege that as a source of variation. Nevertheless, we cannot exclude with absolute certainty that the Curetonianus presents an instance of double translation, since this tendency, as attested elsewhere in the same manuscript, its support for the variant kai lipumenoi is therefore weaker than that of Codex Beze, though it cannot be dismissed entirely. To summarize this point, we can speak of double translation only with certainty when no Greek manuscript contains both elements, and yet the Syriac version introduces them independently. So we are going now to show some examples from the Gospels, from the Old Syriac Gospels, and we will go first of all to the one instance when we can render a verb with two different meanings. So there's a very interesting example in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, 13, about salt, which loses its flavor. And as you can observe in Curetonianus, we have very strange rendering. If the salt loses its flavor and becomes foolish, with what will it be salted? The verb moraino means to act foolishly, to play the fool. We have this verb in the Greek. And dictionaries and translations also suggest a second meaning, to lose its flavor, but especially based on its occurrences in Matthew 5:13 and Luke 14:34. The Sinaiticus and Curetonianus use in translation the verb kapakach, which in Syriac can be translated to be tasteless, insipid, to lose salt, to lose flavor, to become insipid. It therefore seems that Sinaiticus and Curetonianus choose a verb that alludes to both meanings of moraino. Sinaiticus offers only this verb, while Curetonianus adds another verb, shoto, which conveys only one meaning, to act foolishly, to commit a folly. One of the characteristics of the double translation is to provide two words belonging to the same semantic field. One must think that for Curetonianus, even the verb pakach appears here in the sense of to become foolish. But probably the Vetus Syra has not solved the difficulties encountered when one tries to understand this logion of Jesus. It does, however, offer useful suggestions. By introducing the second verb, Curetonianus suggests that the first meaning of the word moraino, so became foolish, should not be underestimated. The translation of Greek with if the salt becomes foolish would sound strange, but Curetonianus, with its double translation, shows that it's possible to apply to salt the verb to become foolish. And by employing the verb pakach, the Vetus Syra, so the Sinaiticus and Curetonianus, suggests that the answer to the difficulty with moraino might lie in the Semitic background of Jesus' logion. In fact, a verb with characteristics similar to pakach, that is, one with a double meaning, might have been used by Jesus in Aramaic with the intention of creating a play on words. So the second example, how to translate hapax. In Matthew 27:5, we encounter hapax legomenon, the aorist of the verb apancho, to hang oneself, which describes the manner in which Judas ends his life. And the Sinaiticus renders this passage with two well-known verbs, to hang and to choke, to strangle. Through this double translation, Sinaiticus provides explicit information about Judas' death. This dual rendering not only clarifies the sense of the passage, but also ensures that the tragic end of Judas is fully and unambiguously understood. And then the third example. Here we've got the example from the Luke. We have here the expression en agro, and the Greek phrase here, en agro, in the field or of the field, could grammatically belong either to the grass, ton horton, or to being today, on tassemeron. We can see this, for example, in the Che, so the translations, only the Italian translation. The translation from 1974 has here, sedunque Dio veste così l'erba del campo, and the nowadays translation of the Che is sedunque Dio veste così bene l'erba nel campo. So the slightly difference. As we can see here, the Curetonianus resolves this grammatical ambiguity by presenting both possibilities. So this is not merely an instance of stylistic fullness, rather it represents a grammatical solution that preserves both potential readings of the Greek construction. So we have here, if the grass of the field, which is today in the field, so they are playing on that, trying to solve a grammatical problem. Maybe the author of the Curetonianus just said, I've got no idea how to put that, if it goes with ton horton or if it goes with on tassemeron, so I'm choosing both of them, both solution. So as we saw till now, as we have seen till now, why would a translator use a double translation? So of course, to bridge the gap between text and reader, and as we have seen, to convey all the nuances of the source language, as for example in the case of Moraino, render with two different verbs, or to render a hapax legomenon more clearly. We've got no idea what does it mean, so let's put another verb in order to see how it goes, or in order to resolve grammatical ambiguities that could otherwise obscure meaning. These are the main reasons that we see for the double translation. So at the end, in the third part of this presentation, just a few words about some possible consequences of the double translation. And I will speak shortly about creating new association, and then once again about the problems with the textual criticism. So let's go to the Matthew 8, verses 5. Then, having entered Capharnaum, a centurion came to him, begging him. And in seeing Curetonianus, Sinaiticus here is there is a lacuna here. After these things, there's a plus in Curetonianus. When he entered Capharnaum, a centurion approached him, and he was pleading with him and imploring him. So we have two different verbs in order to translate parakalon auton. In the translation of the words parakalon auton in Curetonianus, there is an addition of a second verb, so that the verse reads, and he was pleading with him and imploring him. In the Greek manuscripts, we do not find any variant that could be considered as the forlage of this addition. Usually, the verb parakaleo, used in the sense of to ask, to implore, is rendered with verb ba, and therefore it must be regarded here as the standard translation. Attention should be focused on the second verb, kashaf, to pray, to supplicate, to ask. This verb appears in the Vetus Syra only here and in Luke 3:18. In the Peshitta of the Old Testament, however, it is used more frequently, and there are passages where it appears alongside the verb ba'a, so exactly in the same pair of verbs together. We find, for example, this pair of verbs in the book of Genesis, in Job, in the book of Esther. In each of these passages, the pair of verbs, kashaf and ba, is used with reference to prayer addressed to God or to the king, as for example in Esther. And who prays is Rachel or Job or Esther herself. So as we see in Matthew 8:5, we are dealing with a double translation that evokes a wide word of association. On the one hand, these occurrences in the Old Testament, Peshitta of the Old Testament, could explain the renderings in Matthew 8:5. Maybe there's some association done by the translator. On the other hand, such a rendering creates new intertextual connections. Jesus Christ is here in this verse implored by the centurion in the same way as in the Old Testament the God of Israel was implored. Thus the centurion, through his manner of supplication, can be counted among famous figures such as Rachel, Job, and Esther. So the new intertextual connections are created. We have heard in the previous conference that sometimes with the dynamic translation we lose this intertextuality. Here the double translation sometimes adds something to the intertextuality. We have a new, different, more connections created by this kind of proceedings. And at the end, here I have, for example, something taken from Luke, very simple example. After the healing of the person, Jesus is just asking him to return to your house. So we see the Sinaiticus has the same translation, which doesn't go very far well from Greek, return to your house. And in C we have return to your house and to the house of your man. So we have some doubling here for ton oikon su. Usually we translate oikos as house or home, so dwelling, building. Sometimes this noun appears in expressions such as the house of David or the house of Jacob. In these cases, we understand it as referring to the descendants of David or to the nation. It can also denote the household or family. Here we encounter the expression your house. Should we think of it as the building itself? So return to your house, to your building, or rather as the household, the family, or even more broadly to the nation. So go back to your family, go back to your friends. As we see, version in the Curetonianus does not wish to leave us with only one option and offers a double translation: return to your building, to your house, and to your family, to the house of your men. Of course, one might be tempted to link this with Mark 5:19 and to hypothesize the existence of a manuscript containing a reading similar to what we find there, because in Mark 5:19 we have hypostrophe eiston oikon su prostus sus, so return to your house and to your people. However, in this case, the Syriac doublet shows non-dependence on a different Vorlage. Rather, it demonstrates the translator's conscious effort to preserve both the literal and figurative meanings of the same Greek word. So, if we were to find manuscripts with the reading hypostrophe eiston eikon su prostus sus, which would represent a harmonization with the parallel passage in Mark, we could not be certain whether the Lucan text depends on a different Vorlage or reflects a case of double translation. Therefore, to summarize, occurrences of double translation can be used in textual criticism only with great caution. There is no, we can no go use the double translation in the textual criticism without caveat, without being very cautious. And just for the conclusion, we celebrate with this conference, international conference, the 60th anniversary of the Biblia Tysiąclecia, the Bible of the Millennium Bible, and I do not think we can find examples of double translation there, and perhaps there is no reason to attempt renderings such as, for example, here. Maybe there is no point in rendering Makario in Błogosławieni szczęśliwi, blessed and happy are the poor in spirit, or maybe there is no point in rendering Kaime the rendering that creates some problems here in Italy years ago, with nie wódź nas na pokuszenie, nie wprowadzaj w doświadczenie, nie wystawiaj nas na próbę. Do not lead us into temptation, do not bring us to the test, and do not put us to trial, but deliver us from evil. And yet, as we have seen, the ancient Syriac translators were not afraid to include two words where we would choose one, sometimes for clarity, sometimes to reflect the ambiguity of the Greek, and sometimes simply to preserve the richness of the source text. Their work remind us that the translation is not only linguistic transfer, as we already seen in these 2 days, it is also interpretation and reverence for the text. It is the art of letting the sacred text speak in its fullness rather than confining it to the one single meaning. And perhaps, after all, this is not such a bad idea, letting the sacred text speak in its fullness. So this is everything about double translation I want to present today. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Father, for first of all, a fascinating presentation and for great discipline in timing. So it's truly fascinating. It's a highly literate culture, it seems, those of translators of Vetus Syra. So I want to now enlarge this field of inquiry to our audience, everybody who listens us. We can ask questions to our presenter regarding Vetus Syra, regarding the text he discussed, the triple translation actually that you proposed for the Lord's Prayer. It's not only double, it was triple, right? So if we can wait for other questions, I've got one very
Yes.
simple actually. Yes, are there any questions?
Yeah, I would like, if I may.
Sure, go on.
Buongiorno, buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
Yeah, sorry, I am not always here between the lessons and seminars and department meetings, so I apologize for that. Yes, regarding the, I don't have actually a question. I just want to, maybe you know already that here in Italy we produced a new, what we call ecumenical translation of the New Testament. Okay, and there were collaborators from different church denominations, etc., and philologists also. So I was in charge to revise the translation in the light of the apparatus from Matthew to Revelation. So I was curious to get to the Lord's Prayer in the two versions, etc. So now they somewhat changed that Kaimex Senekes Hemasis Perasmon is no more the way it was in the CE translation, Conferenza Episcopale Italiana, but now the translation in Italian sounds e non farci entrare nella tentazione. So it would be like, do not permit us to enter, or do not allow us to enter. That's the idea. It doesn't solve, of course, the main problem, but that's the variant that has been proposed now in this new translation, which appeared in last February.
Just a short comment. Yes, it was, I remember from my defense of the doctoral thesis, you know, if you are in the Biblicum, it means that you are dealing with the Jesuits. And of course, the Pope Francis is Jesuit, you know, the Craig Morrison, our PhD father is from the Carmelite orders, and me, myself, I'm the Franciscan. So the question about the rendering of the our Father in Italian in this time was very, you know, very difficult one and very delicate then. So I was asked about that issue in the Syriac gospel. What we find in the Syriac gospel that yes, there is. It seems that the problem is not in the kaime eisenenkes hemas, but the main issue is with the peirasmon. So the Vetus Syra is rendering this peirasmon with the noun nesiono, which would be very close to the Hebrew that, for example, we find in the Genesis 22:1. You know, when the God is speaking to Abraham, that he's conducting him to the trial, to some kind of prova. So I think, you know, as we have heard also from the Professoressa Monica, the Dr. Monica, the Syriac text is trying to be very close to the Greek. and sometimes it's trying to resolve some problems, but it is not going like, you know, like the 100 years of light away from the Greek text. And so the Syriac text in this special in the Lord's prayers won't help us to resolve the problem of the kaima eisenkes, but could help us in order to resolve the eis peirasmon, opting for the trial, for the prova. So bringing us closer to the Genesis 22:1 theology than to the Jacob and the questions about the temptation.
And just a note, so how would you view this e non farci entrare in relation to Syriac, for example?
The Syriac translation of this is more or less like that, like non farci entrare, because the verb used there is entrare, is to go.
All right.
Okay.
All right, thank you. We ran out of time. And we have to be disciplined in this session. We get 4 presenters. So thank you so much for your questions. And again, Father Tomasz, thank you so much for the great presentation.
Thank you very much.
We are moving to the next presenter that I have a joy to introduce. Father Bartłomiej Kowalczyk, another Franciscan, the Friar Minor, defended his dissertation again with Professor Craig Morrison at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in 2022, La Vetus Syra del Vangelo di Marco, and published it in the subsequent 2023. He teaches at Pontifical University of St. Anthony, Rome, Italy. He publishes in Antonianum, Liber Annum, Revista Biblica, and Enoch. And he will be presenting the paper titled Translations of the Verb Dei in the Gospel of St. John in Ancient Syriac Versions. Father Bartłomiej, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thanks for your invitation. I will share with you my desktop in order to make my presentation more comprehensible. So, just a moment. Do you see my desktop? Yes. Thanks.
Yes, yes, yeah, we can see
Okay.
it.
Yes, it is good.
I will like to begin with a short introduction. The concept of necessity sometimes poses challenging questions on a philological or theological level. For example, when the necessity concerns Jesus' passion. In reality, we are not the first to deal with that problem. Many ancient translators of the Bible already had to decide how to express the aforementioned concept in their languages, given that it was not always possible to translate the biblical text literally. In my presentation, I will briefly focus on the presentation of the verb Dei in John's Gospel in ancient Syriac versions, namely in the Old Syriac, in the Peshitta, and in the Harklean version. The following abbreviations will be used throughout the presentation: GT Greek text, S Syriac Sinaiticus, C Syriac Curetonianus, and P Peshitta. The text of the Old Syriac has not been completely preserved. If the text of a particular biblical passage has not survived, I will indicate this using the word vacat. The Greek verb Dei. The Greek verb Dei is often almost automatically associated with the concept of divine necessity of Jesus' passion or with the concept of the history of salvation. Surely this association is correct in many texts, first of all in the Lucan narrative. However, in the New Testament, they can denote other types of necessity or obligation, for example, moral or religious obligations, the fulfillment of the scriptures, eschatological realities, obligations related to ordinary life. Before directly analyzing the Johannine text with Dei, it may be helpful to somehow anticipate some phenomena and allow the global perspective of its possible translations in Syriac. 3 rather common and widespread choices of Syriac translators of the Gospel of John are Wole, Atit, and Tzadek. Let us now briefly look at these words and their meaning. The most frequent translations of Dei in the Old Syriac and Peshitta of John is Wole, described by J. Payne Smith as follows: the effective verb used impersonally with lamat. It is meet, fit, right, proper, convenient. It ought, it should, it must, behoves. With lamat, the personal pronominal suffix I ought or must. he must, volelan, he must, or should. It is therefore a verb with a very broad semantic field. This may explain its frequent use in the translation of they, given that both verbs they and vole have a rich semantic field. Whereas the significance of the verb vole is quite clear and simple, the passive participle at it poses more challenges. The key issue is the following one. Does at it express only a temporal specification, future, prepared, or close to happen, and have also principally a modal value, it is necessary, must, or destined? Without claiming to deal with that problem in detail, it should be noticed that in recent years some authors, for example Morrison, Szymczak, and myself, have emphasized the modal aspect of at it in Syriac or in Aramaic. This form, at least in some texts, seems to be something more than a temporal marker. It may be useful to remember that in Syriac the future can be simply expressed by a participle or by the imperfect. An additional proof of this modal force of at it, as we will realize, is present in some texts in which at it is kind of plus addition. The third word to be discussed is the verb tzadek, usually impersonal. It is right, it ought, it is due. This verb translates all occurrences of they, the Harklean version. In truth, this phenomenon is not surprising if we consider the modus operandi of the Harklean version, which can be described as a kind of mirror translation, where the text is translated word for word. On the other hand, this way of proceeding makes the discussed version not very helpful for our analysis. For this reason, I will not include the Harklean version in my discussion of the single text. Finally, after these introductory notes, we can focus directly on the verb they and its Syriac translations. All occurrences of they in the Gospel of John can be schematically divided into categories that express in some way their meaning: religious obligation of the Christian existence, Jesus' passion, and Jesus' mission. It will be possible to discuss in detail all these texts, so I will limit myself to few texts with peculiar readings or translations of they. Afterwards, I will offer a short table aiming to illustrate the issue under examination in its entirety, and I will try to propose a kind of synthesis. Let us begin with John 4:20, where they regards the correct place of Jewish worship. I have decided to focus briefly on this text because its Syriac forms could be explained in many ways. This factor is not indifferent, above all when we try to catch the modus operandi of the version discussed. During the conversation of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, the question of the correct place of worship emerges. Where must people worship? The Peshitta offers a literal translation of John 4:20. On the contrary, the Old Syriac shows a peculiar form of text that references the house of worship and does not contain any element that expresses the modal value of they. What can be the source of this singular reading? Probably one has to exclude the Old Testament Peshitta, since this version does not seem to include, as far as I know, the syntagma bet secta. However, there exists another text that could have left its traces in John 4:20 SC, since the discussed reading appears in Ephraim's commentary on Tatian's Diatessaron. Finally, the actual shape of John 4:20 SC may show a certain tendency of the Old Syriac to simplify the text. The place where people must worship is almost like the house of worship. So it's not easy to explain the actual form of John 4:20 SC, as multiple explanations are possible. However, it is obvious that John 4:20 SC does not have the same modal power as its corresponding Greek text. Now I would like to discuss two occurrences of they linked to Jesus' passion. Let us begin with John 3:14. In John 3:14, the first occurrence of they appears, which defines the necessity of Jesus' passion. The Syriac Sinaiticus contains a particular construction that is chva plus lamat plus personal suffix plus lamat plus infinitive. How to interpret this translation? For Merz, this translation is ein Beispiel der Wortlichkeit. This statement is not convincing. Leon is right to criticize Merz. Considering the range of Sinaiticus translations of they, this does not seem correct. He uses chva plus infinitive only twice to represent they plus infinitive, here and Matthew 26:35. If he had wanted to be exactly literal, he would have used Wole lemetteteramu beref denasha. And exactly this form is present verbatim in the Curetonianus. According to Lyon, the translator of the Syriac Sinaiticus, I quote, had restructured rather than imitated the construction of the Greek, end of quote. This restructuring, considering Luzaraga's observations, may be due to the influence of the first part of John 3:14s, Vaikana darim kvamushe chvaya bematbeha. In this manner, we have some kind of parallelism, arim chva and chvale. In Mark 14:31 SP and Matthew 26:35 SP, they is also translated, as you can see, with the verb chva, like in John 3:14s, although the constructions used in the text discussed are not exactly the same. In this three texts, however, they does not have the same shade of meaning, since in Mark 14:31 and Matthew 26:35, they simply expresses Peter's readiness to die with Jesus. So the text of John 3:14s appears as something unique. In John 3:14, the Peshitta translates they with Atid. Is there something special in this choice? For Lyon, Wole and Atid are almost common equivalents. Luzaraga is even more radical, since he interprets the form Atid in an exclusively temporal key. This last interpretation, however, seems reductive because it does not sufficiently consider the semantic richness of Atid. The second day link to the Jesus Passion that I'm going to discuss is present in John 12:34. Starting from John 12:30, Jesus speaks about his death. Jesus lifted up from the earth will draw all people to him. In John 12:34, the crowd responds to Jesus and questions him. One of those questions contains the verb dei, referring to the passion of Jesus. The Syriac Sinaiticus and Peshitta translate dei with Atid. In John 3:14, as seen before, Jesus has already predicted his passion in almost the same way. The only difference in the Greek text is the word order. The Peshitta, in both cases, uses Atid for dei, whereas the Syriac Sinaiticus prefers two different solutions, chva in John 3:14 and Atid in John 12:34. This discrepancy alternates the textual link between John 3:14 and John 12:34. The last occurrence of dei that I'm going to discuss in detail concerns Jesus' mission. On his journey to Galilee, Jesus must pass through Samaria. What kind of necessity is involved here? It can be on the one hand a geographical necessity, since Samaria is located between Judea and Galilee. On the other hand, a theological necessity, since in this manner with Jesus, the evangelization of Samaria will begin. This issue is not easy to resolve, however, it should be noticed that there was also an alternative way from Judea to Galilee, through the Jordan Valley. Thus, in John 4:4, the theological necessity is probably to be favored. It seems that the Syriac versions prefer rather the geographical interpretation of Jesus' necessity to pass through Samaria. This interpretation is very clear in the Syriac Sinaiticus. The readings of the Curetonianus and of the Peshitta are slightly more complicated. If it's true that the quoted versions speak of a kind of need for Jesus to pass through Samaria, it's actually true that an eventual modality expressed by Mavedavat Le does not have the same value and force as that expressed by Dei. The verb dei in the Gospel of John synthesis. As stated before, I would now like to propose a sort of summary that will illustrate the way of translating dei in the Syriac versions under examinations. This short table allows us to point out different elements. First of all, the surgical precision of the Harklean versions that translates all occurrences of dei with tzadek. This modus operandi makes this version almost useless for our research. So I will limit my consideration to the Old Syriac and Peshitta. In this version, the most frequent translation of dei is Wole. It translates occurrences of dei that represent all categories. On the other hand, the use of Atid is more limited and defined. The Peshitta translates all occurrences of dei linked to the passion of Jesus with Atid, whereas the Syriac Sinaiticus oscillates between Fa, John 3:14, and Atid, John 12:34 and John 29. As for the Curetonianus, only the text of John 3:14 with Wole has survived. The case of John 3:14 is therefore particularly interesting due to a divergence between the Old Syriac and the Peshitta. This is a detail to keep in mind. First of all, considering, as pointed out by Brock, that I quote, the Peshitta New Testament is in fact not a completely new translation from Greek, but a revision of the Old Syriac, corrected it against the Greek text, end of quote. In this perspective, the shift from Kva, John 3:14s, or Wole, John 3:14c, to Atid, John 3:14p, becomes even more significant. On the one hand, it may show an inner development of the Syriac language with a semantic refinement of the form Atid and or a work of many translators. On the other hand, it renders Peshitta text more coherent, interconnecting all Jesus' Passion references expressed by they. It is also curious to notice that when translating the occurrences of they link to religious obligations and to the Christian existence, the Syriac Sinaiticus completely leaves out its modal value. In some way, this obligation, as to speak, no longer appear necessary. The other occurrences of Wole and Atid in the Old Syriac and Peshitta. In order to make my analysis more accurate and complete, I will now briefly focus on the remaining occurrences of Wole and Atid in John's Gospel in the Old Syriac and Peshitta. The focus only on these versions due to the fact that in Euchar's edition of the Harklean version, as far as I know, the verb form Wole is absent, whereas the form Atid is used in a mechanical way, exclusively to translate all occurrences of Mello. Trying to create a sort of bridge with the first part of my work, I will reuse as far as possible the previous categories. In the Old Syriac and Peshitta, Atid often translates the Greek verb Mello. Indeed, this is not surprising. At times, the meaning of the verbs they and Mello is quite similar. This phenomenon, however, does not facilitate our research, since the semantic field of Mello is not always easy to explore. The main challenge seems to be the possibility of a sharp distinction between its purely temporal sense, to be about, and its temporal modal aspect. We can read in Liddell Scott, to be destined rightly to, indicated as estimated certainty or strong probability in the present, past, or future. This kind of ambiguity makes Mello similar to Atid. Unfortunately, I cannot discuss the individual text in detail, so I provide you with a table that presents all the other occurrences of Wole and Atid in John's Gospel in the Old Syriac and Peshitta. It seems useful to start here with a numerical observation. The occurrences of Wole, not linked directly to they, are really very few, unlike those of Atid, and are found only in the Syriac Sinaiticus. Obviously, is to be considered here the incomplete nature of the text of the Old Syriac, first of all of the Curetonianus. But let us get back to Wole. In John 13:14s, it defines the attitude of Jesus' disciples, whereas in John 18:14s, the passion of Jesus. This last usage of Wole recurs in some way John 3:14c, where Jesus speaks about the necessity of his passion using just Wole. On the other hand, the presence of Wole in John 18:14s creates quite interesting textual links in the Syriac Sinaiticus. In John 18:14, the narrator recalls Caiaphas' words of John 11:50, already interpreted in John 11:51 as prophecy. The Syriac Sinaiticus present in this text three different lexical choices, although in John 11:50 and John 18:14 appears the same verb synfero. The Peshitta gives the impression of being more coherent, choosing both in John 11:50 and in John 18:14 the same construction with mut and pkach. But it might be interesting to try to place those choices of the Peshitta in a broader context. As shown by the table that we can see, the Peshitta, for the necessity of Jesus' passion, usually almost exclusively uses Atid. So, Caiaphas does not speak about Jesus' passion and its necessity or expediency as Jesus or the narrator does. It should be useful to point out that the ancient readers of the Bible normally didn't know the Greek text that their translation was based on. The impact of the text was therefore different. Recalling here the dynamics of the Syriac Sinaiticus, it seems possible to identify, almost for the reader, three lexical choices that reflect three different perspectives and somehow three different speakers. John 11:50s, pkach plus mut, Caiaphas' speech about the expedience of Jesus' death. John 11:51s, Atit plus Mut, Caiaphas' speech interpreted as prophecy by the narrator. John 18:14s, Vole plus Mut, Caiaphas' speech recalled by the narrator. The perspective of the reader is also shaped by new compared to the Greek text textual links. Let us go back again to the table seen before. In the Old Syriac and Peshitta, the form Atit frequently translates not only day but also mello, or in some cases is a kind of plus. Clearly, these phenomena are not equal in all versions. Nevertheless, this affirmation allows us to create a wider background for our analysis. Looking at our table, you can easily notice that the use of Atit is not limited only to the concept of necessity of the patient, like the case of day, but involves also other concepts such as the mission of Jesus, the events of the end, and the mission of Jesus' disciples. In this manner, all these realities become interconnected in an original way. The concept of eschaton, expressed by Atit, is clear in John 7:39 SCP and John 40:22 SCP. Maybe it's also possible to add John 16:13p, where the adjective atidata appears, which is a peculiar rendering of the Greek text. The two other texts to point out are John 11:27s and John 21:19p. In both texts, we find the form Atit, which is in some way superfluous. All these examples show that Atit is something more than a simple marker of the future, but it also contains a modal force within itself. The above-mentioned modal force of Atit poses sometimes challenges on a theological level. Some occurrences of Atit, classified as linked to Jesus' passion and its necessity, express indeed Judas' plan to betray Jesus, John 6:71 SCP and John 12:4p. In addition, in John 21:19, the Peshitta speaks about Peter's death, adding, as already pointed out, to the text Atit. How to interpret these occurrences of day? Do they express a kind of deontic predetermination? In this context, it seems useful to consider the figure of the speaker. In the text under discussion, the narrator speaks and interprets the events and the temporal aspects. Using the syntagma temporal aspect, I mean a specific relation between the past time of the events described in the biblical text and the present time of the reader. The reader of the Bible is sure that the events defined by Atit will happen, because many of them have just happened in the real story. Moreover, this fact makes certain eschatological events described by Atit, but not yet realized. It suggests that the Atit expresses rather epistemic modality and not the deontic one. Some conclusions. The verb day poses numerous challenges that mysteriously unite ancient and modern Bible translators. The latter are in some ways fortunate, as they can benefit from the work of their ancient colleagues. Indeed, ancient Bible versions can help us better understand the biblical text, especially when it is difficult and problematic. The case of the verb is certainly a good example. Of course, this type of assistance should not always be accepted uncritically. Even ancient Bible translators could have made mistakes or been incoherent. Sometimes perhaps we are unable to fully understand their choices, partly because the data we have is partial. It can be useful to recall here all the passages with the verb day that are not preserved in the Old Syriac. Maybe the presence of this text would lead to slightly different research results than those presented. Another element that unites the work of ancient and modern translators is the concept of responsibility. Often, or rather normally, readers did not know in the past and still don't know today the original text, Hebrew or Greek, which their Bibles are based on. Each translator of the Bible offers his reader the same but also a different Bible, since it's impossible to reproduce all the phenomena of the text being translators. Some translators' choices may be of little consequences. Others, however, such as those involving complex words like they, can have a profound impact on the reader. This fact reminds us of the enormous responsibility of every translator of the Bible and biblical scholar. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your very clear, very detailed, well-informed presentation. Now it's the time for discussions. So we've got Anna Rambier-Kwaśniewska, our colleague from Wrocław. Please go on to ask your question, Anna. Oh, that's actually clapping. It's not a question. It's an applause. It's a round of applause. So,
I'm sorry. Yes,
but-
it was clapping. Definitely.
okay, a round of
Very
applause.
nice.
All right. So, thank you so much. Any other rounds of applause or questions? Do we have any questions for now? we do admire the presentation. That is not too technical, but right enough to be well informed. Now, I was wondering, and I was willing to ask this question to Father Tomasz before, but I'm gonna go on and ask it to you. It seems to be a very well informed, but also very highly literate ambience in which the translators of Vetus Pescita are working. So how would you imagine their workplace actually, where they're surrounded with different copies of manuscripts, traditions they had an access to, and then carefully choosing also or weighing those translations in Greek, maybe in other Semitic languages. What would be the way they actually translated those texts in terms of manuscript culture is definitely a rich and very luxurious one. It's costly too. So I imagine those places where they worked being well equipped and pretty affluent also.
Thank you for a question. This question is not it's not easy, I think, because we need to consider a kind of, I can say, of development of the Syriac translations of the Bible of the New Testament. We can speak, I think, of a development from a reader-oriented translation to a text-oriented translation. After me, Piotr Jutkiewicz will speak about the Harklean version, so he knows better this issue, because the Harklean version is almost as I told, a mirror translation where the biblical text is translated word for word. The Old Syriac, or maybe the situation of the Old Syriac is more complicated from this point of view, because we need to distinguish different phenomena connected, linked to these translations. As pointed out by Tomasz Szymczak, when we try to analyze a specific passage of the Old Syriac, we need to consider almost three hypotheses: the translations hypothesis, the Vorlage hypothesis, and also the transmission hypothesis, because something could have gone wrong during the transmission of the text. So the short answer will be the following one. We have our translators. I can speak about the translator of the Old Syriac were persons who were trying to translate text very carefully, but on the other hand, there were not slaves by the Greek text. They tried to make text comprehensible for their readers. It is clear that in our text we can find traces of other manuscripts, other Syriac, other textual traditions. One aspect that is very peculiar are some connections, we can say, between the Western traditions and the Syriac translations. We have Syriac Semitics, we can say, text that contains some Western elements, aspects. So in the Old Syriac we can find very mysterious elements that we are not able to explain at all. Maybe Tomasz Szymczak would like to add something to my explanation.
If I can
Yes.
just...
Oh, thank you. We can enlarge
If
it,
I
yes.
can just shortly, as we have seen, one of the main problems with the Old Syriac Gospels is the question if we can even speak about one Vetus Syra, because the differences between the version in Curetonianus and in the Sinaiticus are quite big. So we have no idea if there was only one revision of the Diatessaron, or if there are two independent revisions. As we have seen, nowadays there are new discoveries. For example, we have the discoveries in the palimpsest in the Vatican Library, so very fresh one, published 2 years ago by Gregory Kessel. So we are we are still trying to find out if we can even talk about the Vetus Syra, one unique translation, or about two different translations, so one represented by the Curetonianus and maybe the version which we find in the Vatican Library, and the other one represented by the Sinaiticus. So going from here to the milieu, to the actual office with the papers, with the pergamena, with the papyr, I think it's totally impossible.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you. It's nice to listen to a discussion among the specialists. Still, they had to use some manuscripts, right? Or it seems like a literate culture, not so much the oral transmission. Anyway, thanks for both papers. Now we're going on to another presenter. I'd like to introduce Piotr Jutkiewicz. Also a graduate from the Pontifical Biblical Institute 2023. Dissertation he wrote was titled The Gospel of John in the Harklean Version, an edition based upon the earliest witnesses, and again, as the school of Professor Craig Morrison. He taught for a brief period of time at the Catholic Academy in Warsaw, and now he teaches at the Biblical. Congratulations. In Rome. He published multiple articles in Biblical Annals, Vox Patrum, Catholic Biblical Quarterly, Journal of Syriac Studies, Journal of Oriental Studies, participated in grants and research projects like the Editio Critica Major of the Greek Psalter, and is a stipendist of the Swenson Family Fellowship in Eastern Christian Manuscript Studies for Junior Scholars. He'll be presenting the paper titled Mirror Translation, How Should We Define It? Various aspects of the treatment of the Greek infinitive in the Gospel of John, according to the Harklean version. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're good.
We try to share my screen. Can you see?
Yes, it's all
as
clear.
a full screen? Yeah, thank you. So, first of all, you will notice a minor change in the title of my presentation. It is now can instead of how should. It's a little bit stronger in this way. We will see why. I would like to begin with these well-known and brilliant words of Umberto Eco. What does translating mean? The first and most comforting answer would be saying the same thing in another language, except that, first of all, we have a lot of trouble establishing what saying the same thing means. Secondly, because when faced with a text to be translated, we do not know what the thing is. Finally, in some cases, it is even doubtful what it means to say. It is more or less what this entire conference is all about, right? In this concise description, he effectively encapsulates many of the numerous tensions inherent in the translation process. With these words, he begins his book entitled Dire quasi la stessa cosa, to say almost the same thing, in which he explains his concept of translation as a negotiation. This negotiation occurs sometimes consciously and at other times unconsciously, also in the translation of biblical texts. Biblical translations and other translations of sacred texts are generally less dynamic and more literal. Only recently have we started to care, at least to some degree, about functional equivalence in biblical translations. However, aspects of the tension between dynamic and literal translations were already present in antiquity. The history of the Syriac translations of the Greek New Testament, with the best evidence for the 4 Gospels, has a general trajectory from reader-oriented to source-oriented translations. Both the growing experience in the art of translation and increasing respect for the source language played crucial roles in this long process. And I will repeat some of the points already mentioned by the former speakers, but it is useful, I think, to once more present this very rich tradition of the Syriac translations of the New Testament. The first Syriac translations of the New Testament, the Diatessaron, the so-called Old Syriac, may sometimes sound like a paraphrase, as we have seen, to modern readers, as they often incorporate interpretation, including additional explanations or filling gaps in the Greek text. However, the purpose of this alteration was to enhance the clarity of the message in idiomatic Syriac. The Peshitta, a revision of the Old Syriac in the early 5th century, reflects better the Greek text of the Gospels, but still preserves some interpretative readings, and its translation technique is not exceedingly consistent in terms of imitating the Greek. The transition from free to literal occurred gradually, but the most significant turning point may lie around the year 500. It was Philoxenus, Bishop of Mabuk, who strongly criticized the translation in use, that is, the Peshitta, and avidly advocated for a more accurate language. He then sponsored a new translation, the so-called Philoxenian version, prepared by his Choripeescopus Polycarpus. The Harklean version was produced 1 century later at the monastery of Inaton near Alexandria in Egypt by Tomasz of Harkel, who was expelled from his see during the Chalcedonian persecution of Domitianus and found refuge in Egypt. Thomas had earlier received his education at Keneshre, a bilingual monastery esteemed for its distinguished instruction in Greek. This is one of these places where, this is coming back to your question, Marcin, about the transmission. There were these places where some Greek and serious scholarship took place. And Keneshre is important place for in this context. Scholars trained there in the 6th and 7th centuries appear to have been more receptive to some degree of Hellenization of the Syriac language. In particular, Thomas of Harkel, in his translation of the New Testament, sought to closely render the Greek original. It seems that while Philoxenus's concern for a new translation was a theological one, that of Thomas was more philological and, at least from the modern perspective, a text-critical one. Thomas's endeavors to represent the Greek original as closely as possible in terms of vocabulary, grammar, and syntax have often been labeled as mirror translation. However, the degree to which this mirror representation of the original is accurate has yet to be measured. What does it mean? Is there a definition of a mirror translation? Scholars who use this term do so to emphasize an extreme level of formal correspondence between the original and the translation, often considering the artificial nature of such translation. However, it may be noticed that they apply the label of mirror translation according to their own philological sensitivity. For example, it seems that the most usual characteristic of a mirror translation is a word-for-word rendering of the original. It is not clear, however, how accurate this correspondence should be to deserve the mirror category. For example, for Andreas Jukel, the label mirror translation indicates that the retroversion of the Syriac text into Greek is feasible without ambiguity. James Barr was more cautious about the possibilities of retroversion, arguing that modern scholars would have had much greater difficulty in reading back from the Syriac text to the Greek original, which they presuppose. He highlights the fact that to permit the possibility of read back to the original, a yet further step in literalism is required. A one-to-one relationship in both directions has to be established. Some scholars have endeavored to delineate with greater precision the various degrees of literalness of translations. Acknowledging that a continuum exists between free and literal, they have proposed sets of different criteria for analyzing and evaluating particular translations. Sebastian Brock proposed 3 areas of investigation: the size of the text unit considered, the balance of focus given to either the word employed or the meaning it conveys, and the general flow of the sentence, that is, the treatment of the syntax of the source language. Barr proposed 6 criteria for the analysis of the Greek translations of the Greek Bible. Daniel King is even more meticulous in his analysis, combining Brock's and Barr's proposals into 12 criterion set. Is mirror translation necessarily a negative qualification? On this occasion, it is worth noting that there could be various reasons for more literal translations. Recently, Jonathan Moss added historical context to this question, arguing that for the proper interpretation of endeavors aimed at formal equivalence, it is necessary to consider a broader sociological context. Sometimes these transformations may be better described as geopolitical or at other times as theopolitical. The trajectory of increasingly literal translations into Syriac in the 6th and 7th centuries was influenced by different reasons. While the 6th century literal translations were produced in the context of major theological discussions and the exactitude was necessary for their sake, the literal translations of the 7th century should be understood within the context of the dramatic changes in the geopolitical conditions of their production. In the context of the Greek heritage under Persian and Arab threats, despite West Syriac efforts to break away from the Greek-speaking church, the extremely literal translations may be viewed as instruments for educational purposes and therefore as signs of Syriac's strength and not weakness. I would argue that the variants in the margins and numerous notes, both in Greek and Syriac, of various functions preserved in the manuscripts of the 7th century literal translations of both the Old and the New Testaments, may also be signs of the effort to preserve as much as possible of the precious heritage of the past during a period of many threats. The Syriac translation of the 5th column of Origen's Hexapla by Paul of Tella and Thomas of Harkle's translation of the New Testament, we regard them as almost twin projects, have often been referred to as mirror translations and treated as a sign of the decline of the classical language, even though it is clear that the scholars who produced them must have known both languages very well. This paper aims to add nuance to the discussion by analyzing a small yet specific syntactic feature. Is the Harklean version a mirror translation? Only a few of the categories previously listed for analyzing degrees of literality have been employed in the studies of the Harklean version of the New Testament. In general, much more research has been done in the area of vocabulary, possibly because the consistency of vocabulary seems easier to establish than, for example, that of syntax. The high level of vocabulary consistency in the Harklean version has been demonstrated by Andreas Jukel, even though he himself admitted that the lexical consistency of the Harklean is strong but not perfect. He firmly believes in the likelihood of a correct retroversion from Syriac into Greek. This confidence, unfortunately, may appear to rely on initial assumptions. Jukel often describes the translator's intentions and workflow as established facts, even though they are still speculations. Another category worth analyzing is the word order. Brock claims the preservation of the word order of the original indeed serves as the most obvious mark of any literal translation. Indeed, the attempt at this correspondence is sometimes clearly noticeable as oddly artificial. However, elsewhere, Brock rightfully affirms there are certain patterns of word order that Syriac is totally unable to represent. For example, the possessive pronoun cannot precede the substantive but must come after it, usually as a suffix. More generally, it is worth noting that, for example, in the prologue of the Gospel of John, the Harklean word order not only follows the Greek, but is also roughly the same as that of the Peshitta and even the Old Syriac. Therefore, about the mirroring of the word order, it can be said that the translator adheres to the Greek word order as long as it does not interfere with what he considers acceptable in Syriac. The analysis of the consistency of the Harklean syntax is more demanding and less studied. Brock demonstrated several examples of syntactical calques, for example, rendering of the Greek subjunctives of einai and achein by the constructions with it and itle, representation of Greek tenses in Syriac, and the replication of the hypotactic use of the participle in Greek by a subordinate clause with kad. Aaron Butts, while analyzing the grammatical replication of the Syriac existential particle it in verbless clauses to express the Greek verbal copula estin, mentions that the frequency of the appearance of the verbless clauses constructed with the particle it plus a possessive pronominal suffix grew over time in comparison to the simple verbless clause with syntactically juxtaposed predicate and subject. Other characteristics of a stricter grammatical consistency in representing the Greek original by the Harklean translation are briefly mentioned by Daniel King. There are, however, other cases where Thomas of Harkle was less strict than scholars tend to assume. Jerome Lund was the first to oppose using the term mirror translation for the Harklean version, arguing that it could be misleading. He analyzes the treatment of the Greek in the first letter of Peter in the Harklean version across various areas. Specifically, he demonstrates that in the case of addominals, which in Greek are placed between the definite article and its nominal head, the Harklean version does not follow this word order, but is faithful to the Syriac syntax. Lund concludes his analysis: the translation pushes the limits of Syriac, yet does not violate them. It is constrained by the target language in representing the source language. Among other linguistic features, Lund analyzes the treatment of the Greek infinitive by Tomasz of Harkle. This analysis of the infinitive in a short text of the first letter of Peter serves as an inspiration for the analysis of a larger corpus in the present paper. My analysis of the treatment of the Greek infinitive in the Syriac translation is divided into categories based on the functions of the infinitive proposed by Daniel Wallace. The ways of rendering the Greek infinitive in the Harklean version are compared with the Peshitta. The table summarizes the results. I have analyzed the following categories: the complementary infinitive, the infinitive of purpose, the infinitive of result, the infinitive of cause, the infinitive of time, the exegetical infinitive, the infinitive of an indirect discourse, the infinitive as a subject, and the infinitive clause as a direct object. And I owe a side comment here. Some of these categories and whether a particular instance belongs to one or another could be, of course, the object of discussions. Moreover, I realize that the whole categorization is more exegetical than linguistic and is used here only to give some structure to the data analysis. In the next section of the paper, I will share only a few interesting examples. My written version of the paper is more comprehensive in this regard. So the first category is complementary infinitive, ou denatai idein. He is not able to see. In Syriac, verbs of wishing, beginning, being able, and similar may be complemented in 4 constructions: the infinitive, the participle, D plus imperfect clause, or an asyndetic imperfect. It seems that they may appear interchangeably. The overall tendency to mirror this type of Greek infinitive in the Harklean Syriac is clearly noticeable. However, in numerous cases, the D plus imperfect construction is still retained. 19 times the translator of the Harklean version used L plus infinitive in place of D plus imperfect in the Peshitta, that is more than half of the instances, 4 times in place of a participle, and twice in place of the asyndetical imperfect. Nevertheless, 2 times the contrary replacement appears in the Harklean version. D plus imperfect is employed where L plus infinitive appears in the Peshitta. And one more side comment here. This comparison does not suggest that the Harklean version is a correction of the Peshitta. These numbers are presented solely for the purpose of comparing the translation technique in this specific case of verbal system equivalence. Also, throughout my analysis, only the count of how many times the verbal constructions are used is considered, even when different verbs are involved. The next category is infinitive of time, prin, apothanaim, before he dies, before dying. In Syriac, using the infinitive in a temporal clause is impossible, and even the Harklean version avoids it. 6 times kdam de plus imperfect is employed, while the Peshitta had different constructions. Therefore, we can describe this situation as the standardization of this type of construction in the Harklean version while respecting the language's rules. The next category is infinitive as a subject, anastenai, to rise from the dead, dei anastenai. There are 13 cases of infinitives used as subjects of the so-called impersonal verbs like dei or existin. Here, the proportions are different, at least in the Gospel of John. The tendency to replace D plus imperfect with L plus infinitive is lower. In one case, the Harklean version replaced L plus infinitive in the Peshitta and Sinaiticus with D plus imperfect. That is, the contrary change to the usual occurred. Some would expect greater consistency when translating infinitives of specific Greek tenses. However, from this perspective as well, there is no complete equivalence. For example, the 4 appearances of a verb with a perfect infinitive in Greek are translated in different ways in the Harklean version. Only the first is different in the Peshitta and Sinaiticus, where a simple perfect is used. There are certain constructions in which L plus infinitive appears to fit better for Tomasz of Harklean. It certainly occurs more frequently with verbs of modality. For example, for dynamai with infinitive in all 4 Gospels, these proportions here on this slide are for all 4 Gospels, not only for the Gospel of John. For dynamai, we have the infinitive in the Harklean version is used in 91% of instances, while in the Peshitta in 62%. For mello, with infinitive, there is 78% agreement in the Harklean and 44% only in the Peshitta. For zeteo, with infinitive, respectively, 79% and 58%. A few more examples of diversity are worth mentioning here. For example, it is significant to note that the standard equivalent for mello in the Harklean version is atid with 100% equivalency. We have seen that before. While for what follows in place of the Greek infinitive, there is no such equivalence. For example, the typical phrase for the Gospel of John, emelen apothneskein, he was about to die, appears 4 times and it is rendered both ways. Another significant example is John 7:35. There are 3 appearances of mello with infinitives in this verse. 2 of them are the same phrase, melei poreuestai, intends to go, which is translated in the Harklean version each time differently. The first time by infinitive, the second by imperfect, exactly in the same manner as in the Peshitta. Time for conclusion. The 2 main ways of translating the Greek infinitive in Syriac are D plus imperfect and L plus infinitive constructions. They were already in use in the older texts, but the overall trend to mirror the Greek infinitive in Syriac is clearly evident in later, more literal translations. It is evident that the process of grammatical replication at the most fundamental level that is an increase in the frequency of a low frequency pattern, here L plus infinitive, compared to the previously more standard grammatical construction, D plus imperfect, is clearly noticeable in the Harklean translation. Nevertheless, substantial variation persists, and the Syriac infinitive is not used automatically. Instead, Thomas of Harkle demonstrates a considerable degree of syntactical awareness, and the more frequent use of infinitives in Syriac is not a one-directional development. There are a certain number of cases in which the translator preferred D plus imperfect, there where the Peshitta and the Old Syriac used L plus infinitive. The 6 appearances of the infinitive of time are all rendered in the Harklean version by imperfect because it is impossible in Syriac to render a subordinate temporal clause by the infinitive. This limited but still functioning use in the Harklean version indicates that using D plus imperfect to translate the Greek infinitive was neither unusual nor incorrect for Thomas of Harkle. We cannot determine to what extent during a specific period of language development the two structures could have been used and understood interchangeably. It seems that some verbs or constructions triggered the use of infinitives in Syriac more than others. This paper demonstrates, on the basis of a limited and fairly minor example, that the formal equivalence in rendering the Greek verbal system in the Harklean Syriac is certainly not absolute. Thomas of Harkle's approach to translation remained flexible rather than mechanical. He was frequently tempted to imitate Greek syntax. However, this was not a fully planned and structured approach, as has often been generalized. His focus on a close representation of the Greek original did not exclude some creativity and freedom. This confirms an earlier statement by Jerome Lund that a source-oriented translation is a better description than a mirror translation for the Harklean version. First of all, source-oriented translation is not a pejorative label, and second, it does not insist on the totality of literal approach to translation. Even in a source-oriented translation, as in the Harklean version, there is still some room for variation in translation techniques, and the process of translation remains always, in Eco's words, a negotiation between two texts and two worlds. From our current perspective, as if looking backward through the lens of the text and its translation techniques, we can sometimes gain unexpected insights into the translator's own world. As for the translator himself, despite his many and commendable efforts, Thomas of Harkle sometimes only succeeded in doing what Eco describes as dire quasi la stessa cosa. That is, he succeeded in saying almost the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for another well-informed, great presentation. This session is of very high specialization, let's say, and level. Thanks a lot. So we have rounds of applause again from a lot of people, but do we have any questions? So I'm now asking to raise your hands if you have any questions for our presenter. I'm pretty glad that you actually eventually straighten up the issue of mirror translation. You prefer the source-oriented translation, right? Or after the author you quoted. We got a problem with mirror readings in the New Testament exegesis. It sounds really bad. That is, John Barclay explained it. When you do mirror reading, you're actually looking for your own ideology in the text. You have presuppositions you want to insert in the text. You're analyzing. So that's a great conclusion, that it's going to be a source-oriented translation. But that's my comment. Any questions? If not, I have one for our presenter regarding this maybe difference between Harklean and Old Syriac version, considering the grammar that you just analyzed. Does those Harklean pretty literal translations produce any major differences, or differences in terms of theological content, or maybe of regarding the other versions of all the old versions of Syria? So does it come to your mind maybe an example of the text where this literal translation produces some real difference with the other Syriac versions?
Well, thank you for your question. There is no instant example I would have in mind to think about the theological consequences of a literal translation. I think a case by case should be analyzed, as did Bartłomiej for day, for example. If we look at it, certainly in the Harklean, in this case of day or mello, with 100% correspondence often of these kind of structures, we lose some nuance that was there in previous Syriac translations. In this, so we are closer to Greek original. We are 100% faithful to the usage of one word, but we lose some nuance introduced there by previous translators. So there is this, I would say, ambivalence, two movements in two different directions. Yeah.
What I find particularly helpful, and I thank you for this, is the clarification that this faithfulness was produced basically by Muslim conquest, right? So this faithfulness to the Greek text, the traditions that should be preserved, was forced by historical conditions also, right? So it's to some extent, did I get it well?
Yeah, it is our guess, of course. No, there is no evidence, no clear evidence for that, but there are these two processes in movement. So the Syriac Church wants to get away from the Greek-speaking church and institute a separate tradition. They had a separate tradition already, but they want to show their importance somehow. But in the same time, they want to preserve what was there so rich, and in the richness of the tradition, so the wealth. The conquests and the movements all over the Middle East happening in the 7th century, Persians and Arabs, and then all the entire transition, the Syriac becomes only language of literature and liturgy. Christians begin to speak Arabic. They want to preserve what was there during the previous centuries, and we can certainly see this the same thing in the manuscripts of the Harklean version, and the same thing in the Syro-Hexapla. This wealth of notes in Greek and Syriac, comments from the fathers, grammatical comments, text critical comments, even saying that this thing is not in other manuscripts or some only under translations. So there is, for sure, we have not certain evidence, but there is for sure this tendency to preserve as much of the wealth of the previous tradition as possible.
Right, thank you so much. That's on me. I prolonged, but that was an interesting issue. So thank you again for your great presentation.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you. We're moving on to the next presenter, the last one in this session. Rafał Zarzeczny, a Jesuit, a doctor of dogmatic and patristic theology, studied at the Augustinianum in Rome, translator of early Christian and apocryphal literature from classical and Oriental languages like Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopian. He taught at the Nicolaus Copernicus University in Turin and at the Pontifical Faculty of Theology Bobolanum in Warsaw, and now he teaches at the Gregoriana and at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome, publishing also in Vox Patrum. He'll be presenting the paper titled Your Giving May Be in Secret, Matthew 6:4, Further Reflections on the Use of Gospel Texts in Ethiopian Narratives. So the floor is yours, Father. We can't hear our presenter.
Oh, yes.
All right.
Can you
Now
hear me
we're
now?
in.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yes,
very
thank you.
much. Thank you. Now I try to start with my presentation, and that will be the second icon. Yeah. Can you see the presentation? Please confirm.
Not yet. Not
Do you
yet.
see? No, not yet. Maybe not. Understand me. Okay.
All right. Something is moving on. Yes, you can make it a full screen. All right. Now we can see it. It's perfect.
Oh, yes. That's good. So it is well established that the ancient civilization of the East constitute a significant repository of early Christian literature, preserving an extensive corpus of invaluable texts and translations. This is particularly true in the case of Ethiopia. Following the evangelization of the ancient kingdom of Aksum in the early 4th century, translators undertook a sustained effort to render key Christian texts into the local language. As was customary, they began with 4 Gospels. Evidence of these early translations survives in 2 beautifully illuminated codices dated between 390 and 630. These manuscripts remain preserved at the Abba Garima monastery in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. The translation of subsequent biblical books took place at different times and according to various models. Moreover, biblical scholarship is well acquainted with several apocryphal works, such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah, preserved in fully true classical Ethiopic translations, despite the partial or complete loss of their original versions over the centuries. During the early, that is the Aksumite period, these translations were made from Greek sources. However, beginning in the 13th century, translations were produced exclusively from Arabic. The same applies to many patristic homilies and ancient biblical commentaries, as well as a wide range of hagiographic, devotional, and liturgical texts. We typically find this preserved in a large corpus of parchment manuscripts, many still in use, obtained, often poorly preserved, in Ethiopian churches and remote monasteries. This presentation explores a single biblical quotation in text associated with Saint Menas of Egypt, a widely venerated Christian martyr of the early 4th century. Some preliminary ideas of this subject were presented at a symposium in Timisoara in 2022. Subsequent research into the corpus of writings related to St. Menas resulted in a collaborative volume published in a Vox Patrum journal early this year. The present observations continue that line of query. Although I'm not formally a biblical matter scholar, but a patrologist, I will try not to bore the estimated listeners and specialists in modern exegesis. Renowned as a miracle worker, Saint Menas attracted a large number of pilgrims seeking healing to the shrine built over his tomb at Mariut, near Alexandria, a major center of his devotion until the 10th century. The widespread discovery of famous Saint Menas ampulle from Spain to the Caucasus attests to the saint's lasting popularity in late antiquity. His Vita and Martyrdom were composed and translated into numerous classical languages, including Ethiopic. A substantial collection of his miracles also survives, though much remains unpublished and accessible only in manuscript form, although a recent English translation has appeared. The biblical quotation in question appears in the 7th miracle from the Ethiopic collection, though the episode also exists in Greek, Coptic, Armenian, Old Church, Slavonic, and Arabic versions. It recounts the story of a wealthy Orthodox Christian from Syria, in Ethiopic, Besi Syriawi Orthodoxiawi, on pilgrimage to Alexandria and the sanctuary of Saint Menas at Mariut. The Greek version identifies him as a man from Isauria, a detail echoed in a Coptic version, the man from Isauria. However, both the Arabic and Ethiopic texts refer to him simply as a man, a Syrian man, or a Syrian Orthodox man, reflecting the established fact that the Ethiopic collection of the miracles of St. Menas derives from Arabic sources. The account recounts how the pilgrim stopped overnight in a tavern where the greedy owner murdered him to steal his money. Then he cut the body into small pieces with the intention to throwing them secretly into the sea. At that moment, Saint Menas appeared in tavern in the guise of a knight, accompanied by angels, and demanded that the wicked innkeeper confess his crime. When he denied it, the saint miraculously reunited the murdered Syrian's remains and restored him to life. The murderer repented before his victim, and together the two glorified God and proceeded to the sanctuary at Mariut, bearing generous offerings. Thus the narrative concludes. In the beginning of this miracle, we read, "There was a Syrian man, an Orthodox, who possessed many goods. During his journey, he entered the city of Alexandria. Upon hearing about the glory of the martyr Abu Menas, his powers and his miracles, he said to himself, I will go to his church, worship before his pure body, and offer a small gift to his church, so that the Lord may make my way prosperous." He reflected on this thought, recalling the words the Lord said in the Holy Gospel, "Let your giving be in secret, and your Father who is in heavens will reward you openly. Directly relevant to our study, it is the question from Matthew 6:4, which explains the original Syrian's motivation to offer his gift anonymously at the shrine of St. Menas. And this is the passage read, and he's considered this thought that the Lord said in the Holy Gospel, let your giving be in secret, and your Father, who is in heavens, will reward you openly. The text is nearly identical across all three extant Ethiopic manuscripts of the miracles, showing only minor variants. Manuscript A, the oldest one, reads his Holy Gospel, whereas Codex C has the giving, while two other codices retain the personal pronoun your, singular, giving. More significant differences emerge, however, when this quotation is compared with the text of the Gospel of Matthew as preserved in various recensions of Ethiopian Bible. During the Greek text, turning to the Greek text of the Gospel, it reads as follows: so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father, who sees in secret, will reward you. Additionally, let us consider the same text in the Arabic version. We can read, so that your alms may be in secret, and your Father, the one who sees in secret, he will reward you publicly. Likal takuna tzedakatuka fi al-kafa, fa abuka aladi yara fi al-kafa, huwa yajizika alania. The foregoing analysis invites several important considerations. The biblical verse quoted in the miracles is not an exact citation, but rather a paraphrase, aligning with the ancient tradition of using scripture to elucidate aspects of Christian life. In such cases, passages may be abbreviated or freely adapted to a suite context, with occasional significant changes reflecting the editor's theological or rhetorical aims. Minor variations between manuscripts or recensions naturally arise over time. Notably, this verse from Matthew appears in the Greek and Coptic versions of the Miracle of St. Menas, but seems absent from the Arabic version. Yarit's edition makes no mention of it. However, it is premature to conclude that the Ethiopian version was directly influenced by non-Arabic texts, especially since none of our known Arabic manuscripts contains this quotation of Matthew 6:4. The 2 points, however, warrant a more detailed commentary. The Greek expression psyche eleemosine in Matthew 6:4 is translated into Ethiopic as mitzvot ke. The term mitzvot appears in several biblical texts and generally means almsgiving, alms, or charity. It derives from the Hebrew mitzvah, meaning order, commandment, or obligation. However, the Aramaic mitzvete carries the added sense of good deed, almsgiving, or alms. And the Syriac mitzvoto likely influenced the Ethiopic term. This meaning is consistently in both the Gospel and the 7 miracles of St. Menas. Older manuscript 8 and B of the miracles preserve a formulation identical to the Gospel text, mitzvati ke, including the second person possessive suffix. Manuscript C, dated to the 18th century, omits the suffix ke, deviating from the biblical manuscript tradition that consistently includes it. This divergence raises question: is it a lectio difficilior or scribal error, or a deliberate omission? Moreover, in manuscript C, the term appears in the accusative form, mitzvate, consistent with the Semitic construction of the verb kone, meaning be, became, exist, or to take place, where here in the subjunctive form, yikun. This construction is typical for later Ethiopic translations derived from Arabic and raises the question once again: does this form reflect the original Arabic model of the 7th miracle? Though the question is absent from the Arabic manuscripts quoted by or cited, presented by Yarit's edition, the possibility of a more precise translation influenced by Coptic text and preserved in another Arabic manuscript cannot be excluded. The Arabic Gospel text, however, reads tzedekatuke, meaning your alms or your charity. Nevertheless, the mixed origin for the entire passage remains possibility. The second significant alteration of the biblical text consistently attests in all 3 Ethiopian manuscripts of the miracles reads, "And your Father who is in heavens." This differs from the Ethiopic Gospel text, which reads, "And your Father who sees in secret," closely following the Greek text. Notably, in the miracles, the phrase "who is in heavens" replaces the Greek participium presentis activi form of hoblepon, who is seeing, who sees, and the Greek was accurately rendered in the ancient Abuna Garima Gospels by means of the demonstrative relative pronoun as ze yarieke, meaning who is seeing you. While the Arabic version of this passage is unattested, again, the Coptic version closely follows the Greek Gospel, "and your Father who sees you in secret." It is possible that the phrasing in the Ethiopic miracles was influenced, however, by Matthew 6:1. "Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your," plural, "Father who is in heaven." However, in the Ethiopic version of Matthew 6:1, the possessive pronoun is plural, abukemu, your plural father, as in Matthew 6:8, 6:14, or 16:15. By contrast, in Matthew 6:4, 6:6, and 6:18, likewise in the 7th miracle, the pronoun is unmistakably singular, abuke, your father. Beyond abbreviating the original biblical quotation and omitting elements irrelevant to the immediate narrative, the expression Ze besemayat, who is in heavens, may also evoke the opening the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, Abune ze besemayat, and a phrase, of course, familiar to all Christians. This prayer, moreover, is found in the same 6th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, where, however, the first person plural pronoun is used, both in Greek and in Ethiopic. The modification found in the miracle was therefore likely deliberate, intended to invoke the authority of God the Father more emphatically within the narrative, especially in the lead-up to the relative revelation of the merchant's wickedness and the saint's punishment. Secondly, the Greek phrase in secret, entokrypto, varies notably in Ethiopic Gospel versions. The older Ethiopic recension, model A, B, and D, render it as bekidun, from the root kidne, meaning to cover, hide, cloth, or veil. This choice is significant, paralleling Romans 2:29, where it denotes an inner spiritual reality cancelled from the external world. In the so-called eclectic recension of the Ethiopic Matthew 6:4, bekidun is replaced by the more common behibue, from the root hibe, similarly meaning to hide or to cancel. This form is also attested in the miracles. The Arabic biblical text aligns closely with the Greek model, rendering the phrase as aladi yara fi alahafai, literally the one who sees in secret. To summarize, the medieval redactor of the Miracles of St. Menas revised the biblical quotation by replacing the qualitative expression who sees you, ho blepon, ze ke, with the broader phrase who is in heaven, ze besemayat, a common designation for the Godfather, possibly influenced by the Lord's Prayer. Additionally, the translation of in secret, entokrypto, behibue, appears to reflect an Arabic linguistic context, suggesting this revision occurred relatively late in the text redaction. This passage highlights the complex, layered process of revision of the Ethiopic Bible text. While the Arabic Vulgate had a clear and decisive influence, the roles of other textual traditions, especially those rooted in hagiographical literature and vernacular scriptural engagement, must also be recognized. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this presentation. To Syriac, we have added another pile of ancient languages, even more difficult. There was I heard Arabic, right? And we had Ethiopic. So now it's the time to ask questions to our presenter, the last in this session. We've got a couple of minutes, so feel free, raise your hands or ask questions. I find extremely interesting those ancient Arabic and Ethiopic translations, actually. To what extent are they similar? Can you say us maybe something about Arabic and Ethiopic? Is it all the same, or do we have some substantial differences, or the strategies behind those translations? That's absolutely exotic.
Well, it's not really exotic. I try to demonstrate at the beginning this it's a quite biblical language, and we consider, of course, classical Ethiopic as a pure Semitic language, and it is the literature demonstrates clearly that the Arabic was a bridge for Ethiopic translations, but as I said, only in the medieval time. Majority of the Aksumat translated texts were made on Greek texts. However, Ethiopic is being Afro-Asian family language is preserve pure Semitic matrix. However, lexic, of course, is different, and over the centuries, lexic, this classical Semitic lexic was enriched with Cushitic influences, of course, and now the process is, of course, is much more difficult. However, for the Christian literature, we observe many similarities and calques, copies from Syria, especially from Syriac matrix. Just a simple example. The fate in Ethiopic, Syriac, of course, is Haimanuto. In Ethiopic, we say Haimanata.
Well, it's almost the same, yeah.
Almost.
Sounds the same. Right. It's now New Testament and Greek sounds so simple. I take this opportunity to greet Armand Puitoresh, who is with us also, our good friend from Rome. It's been a fascinating session. I know we had a couple of minutes that I stole from you, so we can have one more question. And we've got one from Shlomi Efrati. Please go on.
Yes, thank you very much, Rafael. A very interesting presentation, very interesting saying also. I wanted to ask about the word mitzvata and its relation to the Aramaic mitzvata. As far as I am aware, this lexical development in Aramaic of mitzvata, meaning almsgiving, appears in Western Aramaic, I know it from Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, and are rather late, so let's say late antiquity. So do we have here an example of a borrowing of
yes, I have several.
Aramaic?
Yes, I have several, but not directly in Aramaic. So, well, in the one, yes, there is an example of also in Aramaic in a Aramaic commentary, but mostly in Christian Syriac, in Christian Aramaic, in Syriac texts, in Afrahat and in Ephraim, the Syrian. We find several times mitzvah takes this meaning of alms or almsgiving.
So this meaning also appears in Syriac.
Yes, in Syriac, but also in some Aramaic texts. However, that would be interesting to following the influence, which is. But perhaps that could be also an effect of Christian literature influence on the Aramaic text.
Yeah,
All right. Thank you for this question.
Thank you.
We still have about 1 or 2 minutes for a short question if somebody's interested. So feel free or to ask our speaker, the last one, the questions. If not, if there's none, we can conclude this session. It was very intense. We had 4 speakers, a lot of Syriac, a bit of Arabic, and Ethiopic. So a lot of, I'm not saying exotic, but I'm actually saying exotic languages in biblical studies. That is from the point of view of New Testament scholar, obviously, but very, very intense and well-informed session. Thank you for all the papers. I'm reminding you that we'll have still 1 session to go in the afternoon but it is to I'm giving my voice now to Henrik Dravno that will guide us through the outline of our conference. We're concluding with the New Testament session and the translation of New Testament texts.
I don't think I have anything more to say, because just we have finished a very intense, as you said, a very also interesting session. And I think that these ancient languages are not so exotic in biblical studies as you think. They're quite important, and as you see, also intensively studied. We are also honored during this last hour morning session with the presence of Father Armand Puish-Itarech, who is the president of the Holy See Agency for the Evaluation and Promotion of Quality in Ecclesiastical University and Faculties. Welcome, Professor Armand, and many thanks for your presence here. If you'd like to say a word, that would be great. Of course.
Attivare audio. Now,
Yes.
are you hearing me? Yeah.
Yes, we are.
No, and I was really interested in greeting you and in trying to be present in this important and very wissenschaftlich meeting. Yeah. So my impression is that the quality, as we had tried to foster it, has to be shown in concrete experiences, scientific moments, and one of those moments is of course this one. So I have some friends here. For instance, I don't know whether he's hearing me, Professor Raymond Bieringer from Leuven. I know him quite well because I am a biblical scholar as well as Raymond, yeah, and Martin, of course, and Marcin, and some other people. So thank you very much for this important international symposium, and thank you very much for contributing to the high level of the church studies. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor. So, as Marcin has said, we have still one session to go in the afternoon at 3 p.m., which is going to also to be very interesting and important. This time we are going to focus on the Greek New Testament. So, Father Marcin will be one of our speakers today in the afternoon. Thank you very much for all the speakers of today's sixth session during our conference, and see you after lunch break at 3 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
To all the participants.